not let anyone who delights in false humility and the worship of angels disqualify you. That's Colossians 2.18. And if you just read that in your standard English Bible, it seems, well, pretty straightforward. It sounds like a warning against idolatry. Don't bow down to angels. Simple.
You would think so. But that one little phrase in the Greek, it is not simple at all. In fact, it might be one of the most grammatically ambiguous phrases in the whole New Testament. It's a genuine minefield, and how you read it changes, well, it changes everything about this letter.
A grammatical minefield. Okay, how so? You have to walk us through that.
Okay, so it all hangs on what we call the genitive case. The Greek phrase is treskeia tenton angelon. And a genitive construction like that can be read in two very different ways.
Right.
It could be an objective genitive. That means worship that is directed at the angels.
So humans worshiping angels, that's the traditional view.
That's the traditional view, yeah. But a lot of scholars, and F.F. Bruce is a big one here, they argue it's actually a subjective genitive.
Subjective genitive.
Meaning it's the worship that is performed by the angels themselves.
Wait, so the humans aren't worshiping the angels. They're trying to join in on the angels' own worship of God.
Exactly. It completely reframes the problem. Suddenly, the issue isn't pagan idolatry seeping into the church. The issue is a kind of super spiritual mysticism. It's this desperate, maybe even arrogant attempt by humans to force their way into the heavenly throne room, to bypass the normal channels and participate directly in the heavenly liturgy.
And that completely changes the motive, doesn't it? It's not about replacing God with angels. It's about trying to get closer to God, but in the wrong way.
It's a spiritual shortcut.
Yeah.
And it suggests they felt this profound insecurity. Like they were living in this hostile cosmos full of spiritual powers and forces, and they needed to get to the real power behind the scenes.
And for them, that meant getting past Jesus or maybe supplementing him to get access to the powers that really run things.
That's the core tension of Colossians. This letter isn't just a friendly update. It's a direct theological corrective against what you could call a Jesus plus theology.
Jesus plus. I like that.
It's the idea that, sure, Jesus is great. He's essential for salvation, for getting you to heaven. But if you want to be truly safe now, if you want to be full, if you want to survive the elemental spirits of this world,
you need Jesus plus something else.
Jesus plus visions.
Yeah.
Jesus plus ascetic rules. Jesus plus angel magic.
Okay, so today we are doing a deep dive into the introduction of the letter to the Colossians. We're going to investigate the crime scene, so to speak, the city of Colossae, and look at the main suspects for what this heresy really was. But I think before we get into the high-flying theology, we have to get our feet on the ground. We need to look at the map.
We absolutely do. The geography here is not just background scenery. It's shaping the whole conversation.
So take us there. Where in the world is Colossae, and why does it matter so much?
We are in the Lycus Valley. Geographically, this is in a region called Phrygia, which today is part of modern Turkey. Back then, it was the Roman province of Asia, about 120 miles east of the major port city of Ephesus. It's a really fascinating and volatile piece of land. F.F. Bruce describes this massive limestone gorge. And ancient writers tell us the Lycus River itself actually disappears underground for about half a mile. It just plunges into a chasm before reemerging.
That sounds incredibly dramatic. That's not a gentle rolling countryside. That's like a setting from a fantasy novel.
It is. And that visual of things disappearing and reappearing might even play into the local mindset. It's also an area that's really known for earthquakes. Seismic activity is a constant threat, which becomes tragically relevant to the city's story.
Okay, so dramatic landscape. But what about the city itself? By the time Paul's writing, what's its status?
By the New Testament era, Colossae is, well, to be blunt, it's a bit of a has-been.
A has-been.
Yes. If you rewind a few hundred years to the time of Herodotus or Xenophon, they call Colossae a great city. It was a major stop on the big east-west trade route, the one that went from Ephesus all the way to the Euphrates River. Armies would stop there, big important people would pass through. But by Paul's day, things had changed.
The highway got rerouted.
Essentially, yes. The main trade route shifted a bit to the north, favoring its neighbors. You've got Laodicea about 10 or 12 miles to the west, and Hierapolis about 12 miles northwest.
And they started to boom while Colossae declined.
They absolutely boomed. Laodicea became this huge financial and banking center. It was the administrative hub for the whole region. And Hierapolis became famous for its hot springs, these mineral baths. It was like a health resort.
So Colossae is this small town stuck between a first-century Wall Street and a luxury spa.
That's a great way to put it. It's overshadowed. It's this small town whose glory days are in the rearview mirror.
That has to do something to the collective psychology of a place. A kind of civic inferiority complex, maybe.
I think so. But they did have one claim to fame left, one thing they were known for.
Which was?
Their wool, specifically a product they called collicinus. It was this peculiar, very valuable dark red or maybe purple wool. The unique chemistry of the water and the minerals in the soil from all the volcanic activity made it perfect for grazing and for dyeing wool.
So they weren't the banking capital anymore, but they were still on the map for this luxury textile.
Right, it was their one remaining industry of note.
Okay, so we've got a shrinking city, overshadowed by its wealthy neighbors, famous for its purple wool.
Let's talk demographics. Who is actually living there? Because this isn't just a generic Gentile city, is it?
No, not at all. And this is absolutely crucial for understanding the philosophy that Paul is writing against. Colossae is a melting pot. You have three main streams flowing into one another.
Okay, what are they?
First, you have the native Phrygians. These are the indigenous people of the area, and they have a very deep, very old history of folk religion. Spirit worship, ecstatic cults, that sort of thing. So a layer of local superstition and folk magic.
A deep layer, yes. Second, you have the Greek colonists. They brought the Greek language, Greek philosophy, and the whole Hellenistic way of life.
And the third?
The third, and for this letter, this is maybe the most important, is a very significant Jewish population.
How significant are we talking? Because sometimes we imagine just a handful of Jewish families in these Gentile cities.
No, this was a substantial, well-established community. The historian Josephus tells us that about 200 years before Paul, the Seleucid king Antiochus III actually moved 2,000 Jewish families from Mesopotamia into this region to act as a stabilizing force.
2,000 families, and over 2 centuries, that population would have grown significantly.
Exploded. Some estimates put the number of Jewish people in the wider district as high as 50,000. And we have other evidence, too. Cicero, the Roman orator, he mentions a legal case where a huge amount of gold was seized by the Roman governor in this very region.
And the gold was?
It was the temple tax money being collected by the Jewish communities to be sent to Jerusalem. The sheer amount of it implies a large and relatively prosperous Jewish community.
Wow, so you've got this potent mix. Phrygian folk magic, Greek philosophy, and a very strong established form of diaspora Judaism, all swirling around in this small, declining town.
Exactly. It's a recipe for syncretism. It's a recipe for new religious ideas to form.
Now, in most of our deep dives into Paul's letters, we're talking about a church that Paul himself planted, but that's not the case here, is it?
No. And that's a key piece of the puzzle. Paul almost certainly never set foot in Colossae. He says in the letter that he has heard of their faith, which is very different from his language in, say, Galatians or Corinthians, where he's constantly referring to their shared history.
So if Paul didn't start the church, who did?
A man named Epaphras.
Tell us about him.
Epaphras was a local. The text calls him one of you. He was a native of Colossae. The most likely reconstruction is that Epaphras traveled to Ephesus during Paul's long 3-year ministry there. Remember, Ephesus is the big city on the coast.
So he meets Paul, gets converted, becomes a disciple.
And then he goes back home. He goes back to the Lycus Valley and becomes a missionary to his own people, planting churches not just in Colossae, but also in Laodicea and Hierapolis.
So Paul is like a spiritual grandfather to this church. He's the apostolic authority, but he's writing to people he's never met, based on a report from their pastor, Epaphras.
Precisely. And the occasion for the letter is that Epaphras has come to Paul, who is in prison somewhere, with a report. And the report is basically, things are going well, they love the Lord, their faith is strong, but there's something strange brewing. There's this weird teaching taking hold.
And there's an urgency to this whole situation. There's a ticking clock hanging over this letter that we have to mention.
The earthquake.
Yes, the earthquake.
Sometime around AD 60 or 61, a massive earthquake just devastated the entire Lycus Valley. We know this from secular history. The Roman historian Tacitus records it. And he mentions that Laodicea, which was just down the road, was so wealthy that they actually refused financial aid from Rome and rebuilt the city entirely out of their own pockets. It was a huge point of civic pride.
But Colossae wasn't so lucky.
Colossae, it seems, never really recovered. It was already in decline, and the earthquake was the knockout blow. It just sort of fades from history after this.
So this letter arrives basically moments before the city is physically destroyed.
It's very, very likely. This might be the final piece of theological instruction this community receives before their entire world literally collapses around them.
That adds a whole other layer of gravity to the text, doesn't it? When Paul talks about the things that can be shaken versus the kingdom that cannot be shaken, for them, that's about to become brutally literal.
It gives it a haunting relevance.
Okay, that is a powerful stage setting. So let's get into the heart of the matter. Why is Paul, or the author, and we'll get to that question in a moment, why are they writing this letter? Let's tackle the million-dollar question. What is the Colossian heresy?
Right. And for centuries, scholars have tried to pin a single, neat label on it. The text itself calls it a philosophy and empty deceit, which is, not very specific.
The old view, going back to the 19th century and scholars like J.B. Lightfoot, was that it had to be Gnosticism, right?
Yes, Gnosticism was the go-to explanation. Specifically, something like the Valentinian system, which was this very complex second-century movement with secret knowledge, a distinction between the creator God and the true God, a whole hierarchy of spiritual beings called eons.
Or maybe the Essenes, the Jewish sect that gave us the Dead Sea Scrolls with their focus on purity and angels.
Those were the main theories. But the problem, as most modern scholars see it, is one of timing. Full-blown systematic Gnosticism is really a second-century phenomenon. To find it here, in a letter from the 60s AD, is anachronistic.
It's like finding a blueprint for a smartphone in a medieval manuscript. The ideas might have precursors, but the system itself doesn't exist yet.
That's a perfect analogy. You can see the seeds of Gnosticism, maybe.
Yeah.
But you can't call the seed the tree.
So if it's not Gnosticism, what is it? And this is where our three main guides for this deep dive, F.F. Bruce, James Dunn, and Douglas Moo, really offer different paths. Let's start with Bruce. What does he see happening in Colossae?
Bruce goes right back to that verse we started with, Colossians 2.1e, the worship of angels.
Yeah.
And he makes a fascinating connection to a very specific strain of Jewish mysticism. It's often called Merkabah mysticism.
Merkabah. That's the Hebrew word for chariot, isn't it? From Ezekiel's vision.
It is. It refers to Ezekiel's vision of the throne of God, this incredible, terrifying chariot throne with the wheels within wheels and the four living creatures. In certain Jewish mystical circles, the ultimate spiritual goal was to have a visionary experience of that throne. It was about heavenly ascent.
Heavenly ascent. You mean actually traveling to heaven in a vision?
Yes. They had this cosmology of layered heavens, usually 7 of them, and each heaven was guarded by angels.
So it's like a spiritual video game. You have to get past the gatekeeper on level 1 to get to level 2 and so on.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
You had to know the right passwords, the right names of the angels to get past them. And the ultimate goal was to ascend all the way to the highest heaven, enter the throne room, and join the angelic choir in worshiping God directly.
So when the text talks about the worshiping of angels, Bruce is saying it doesn't mean praying to the angels.
He's saying it means participating in the worship conducted by the angels. That's the subjective genitive reading. You're not trying to replace God with Michael or Gabriel. You're trying to become like them. You want to stand in the heavenly liturgy and hear the holy, holy, holy with your own ears.
Okay, that makes a kind of sense, but how would they have tried to do that, practically speaking? What was the method?
Rigorous asceticism. That's where the other warnings in chapter 2 come in. The do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. The idea was that the body is what anchors your spirit to the earth. So through extreme fasting, harsh treatment of the body, and following all these strict rules, you could weaken the body's hold and induce a visionary state where your spirit could fly free.
And the central problem with that from a Christian perspective would be what? Because, wanting to worship God more profoundly sounds noble on the surface.
The problem is that it implies Jesus isn't enough. It makes Christ's work on the cross incomplete. If you have to master secret techniques and starve yourself to get access to God's throne room, then Christ's death didn't actually tear the veil from top to bottom.
It creates a two-tiered system.
Precisely. You have the ordinary believers who just trust in Jesus, and then you have the spiritual elites, the mystics, who have had the real experience. It undermines the sufficiency of Christ.
A Jesus plus mysticism model. Okay, that's Bruce. Let's pivot to James Dunn. He's known for his focus on the Jewish Christian context. Does he buy this mystic chariot ride theory?
Not really. Dunn is much more down to earth. He looks at the same textual evidence, especially the references in Colossians 2.1c to Sabbath, new moon festivals, and food laws. And he says, look, this is all straightforwardly Jewish. We don't need to invent some exotic mystical sect.
So he sees the problem as being rooted in Judaism, but not necessarily mysticism.
Right. He strongly rejects what he calls the syncretistic soup model. He doesn't think it's a weird mix of paganism and Judaism. He thinks the philosophy Paul is opposing is actually what he calls a Jewish apologia.
A Jewish apologia. What does he mean by that?
Okay. Try to imagine the situation on the ground. You're a new Gentile convert to Christianity in Colossae. You've turned your back on the pagan temples, but this new church you're part of is small. It's new. It probably looks a little shaky from the outside.
Meanwhile, the synagogue down the street is ancient, it's respected, it has a long history and tradition.
And it has legal protection. Judaism was a religio licita in the Roman Empire, a legal recognized religion. Christianity was this new, strange, and legally ambiguous movement.
So there's a power imbalance.
A huge one. And Dunn's theory is that the local Jewish community is looking at these new Gentile Christians and essentially saying, you folks think you're the people of God. You're not even keeping the basics. You don't observe the Sabbath. You don't follow the food laws. You don't have the calendar. You don't have the covenantal signs that mark out God's people.
So it's a form of social and religious peer pressure.
Exactly. Dunn argues that the philosophy wasn't some external heresy attacking the church. It was an internal pressure. It was the local Jewish community presenting their ancestral faith as a superior, more complete, and safer wisdom.
So they weren't saying Jesus is false, they were saying Jesus is incomplete.
Precisely. They were saying to be truly saved, to be truly full members of God's people, you need Jesus, yes, but you also need to come under the umbrella of the Torah. You need the Jewish distinctives to be complete.
For Dunn, then, the heresy is the temptation for these Christians to retreat back into the safety and structure of Jewish observance because they feel spiritually naked and vulnerable without it.
That's his argument. It's a synagogue apologetic that tempts them to believe that Christianity without Torah is insufficient.
That makes a lot of social sense. It really grounds the conflict in history. But that brings us to our third guide, Douglas Moo, and he brings in a word that sounds very academic, apotropaic.
Yes. Moo, drawing very heavily on the work of another scholar named Clinton Arnold, takes a different tack. And this view is fascinating because it takes the Phrygian context very seriously.
The folk magic element.
The folk magic element, exactly. The ancient world, and Phrygia in particular, was seen as a very superstitious place. The air, for them, was thick with spirits. They called them the stoicheia, the elemental spirits of the universe.
Not just gods and goddesses, but lesser spirits, demons, local powers.
Everything.
Yeah.
In the ancient mindset, the world wasn't run by impersonal forces like gravity and physics. It was run by a vast hierarchy of spiritual beings. Spirits controlled the weather, the crops, your health, childbirth, your luck. And people were, frankly, terrified of them.
They were living with a constant sense of spiritual anxiety. Weltangst.
That's the perfect word for it. And apotropaic magic is simply magic designed to ward off evil. It's defensive magic.
So wearing amulets, reciting incantations, that kind of thing.
Exactly, calling on powerful names to protect you. And in this view, the Colossian heresy is a classic example of religious syncretism. You take a little bit of Christianity, because Jesus is clearly a powerful name. You add a little bit of Judaism, because the Jews have very powerful names for God and for archangels like Michael and Gabriel who command legions. And you mix in a little bit of local Phrygian folk belief. You blend it all together into a comprehensive spiritual security system.
This feels the most modern in a strange way. It's the spiritual buffet. I'll take Jesus for my eternal soul, but I'll also sage my house to get rid of bad energy and check my horoscope for guidance and maybe pray to an angel for a good parking spot.
It's the exact same impulse. It's born from Weltangst, from cosmic anxiety. Moo and Arnold argue that these people weren't denying Jesus. They probably affirmed him as Lord. They just didn't think he was strong enough or maybe specific enough to handle all the local spirits and powers that made their daily lives so frightening.
So they needed Jesus.
Plus a whole toolkit of rules and angel magic to keep the demons at bay.
That's a really powerful picture. The idea that Jesus is sufficient for heaven, he gets my soul to the afterlife. But for the messy, scary business of life here on earth, I need a supplement. I need something extra.
And that is the very heart of what this letter attacks. The central argument of Colossians is that Christ is not just the Savior for the next life. He is the Creator, the Sustainer, and the Lord of this life. He created all those powers. He disarmed them at the cross, and he holds the entire cosmos together by the word of his power. If you have him, you have the source. You don't need the supplements.
We're going to get so much deeper into that incredible theology, especially in chapter 1. But before we can fully weigh the theological claims, we have to address the elephant in the room, or maybe the author in the room. Did Paul actually write this letter?
And this is the great critical tension surrounding the book. If you open your Bible, the title says the Epistle of Paul to the Colossians. But if you pick up a critical commentary, like one from Raymond Brown, he'll tell you that something like 60% of modern critical scholars believe Paul did not write it. They classify it as Deutero-Pauline.
Deutero-Pauline, meaning a second Paul.
Meaning it was written by a disciple or follower of Paul in Paul's name, most likely after Paul had died.
Okay, so why? What's the evidence against Pauline authorship? Because to a layperson just reading it, it certainly sounds like it could be from Paul.
The arguments from the skeptical side generally fall into 3 buckets: vocabulary, style, and theology.
Let's break those down. Vocabulary first.
Scholars who analyze the Greek text have counted the words, and in Colossians, they've identified 34 hapax legomena.
Which is a fancy term for?
A word that appears only once in the entire New Testament. So these are 34 words that show up here in this short letter, but nowhere else. And there are also many words that are common in Colossians that Paul never uses in his undisputed letters, like Romans or Galatians.
34 unique words in such a short letter. That does sound like a lot. It suggests a different working vocabulary.
It's statistically noticeable, yes. Then there's the second bucket, style. Think about the style of a letter like Galatians. It's punchy, it's fiery, it's argumentative. I'm astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you. He uses rapid-fire rhetorical questions. It's very dynamic.
And Colossians, by contrast, is...
Colossians is much more liturgical. It's flowery. It has these very long, flowing sentences that feel more like a hymn or a formal prayer. And it has a stylistic tick that scholars call genitive strings.
A genitive string. Give me an example of that.
It's when you pile up nouns in the genitive case. Something like the word of the truth of the gospel, noun of noun of noun, or the hope of the glory of God. It creates a very different, more meditative rhythm than Paul's usual style.
Okay, so different words, different sentence structure. What about the third bucket, the theology?
The theology is seen by some as being too developed, too high for the Paul of the 50s. The Christology, the doctrine of Christ, is incredibly elevated. He's not just the Messiah. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, the one in whom all the fullness of God dwells. Also, the view of the church, the ecclesiology, is more universal and cosmic than in Paul's earlier letters.
So scholars like James Dunn see this as a kind of bridge letter.
Exactly. Dunn's position is that it was likely written by someone like Timothy or another close disciple, perhaps after Paul's death, and it represents the next generation of Pauline thought. It's a bridge between the historical Paul and the later theology we see in a book like Ephesians.
But that's not the only view. Douglas Moo, for one, pushes back hard in defense of Paul, doesn't he?
He does. And the arguments for authenticity are, I think, very compelling. They focus on the internal evidence of the letter itself.
Okay, what's the first line of defense?
It's what you could call the personal details argument. Just read the end of the letter, chapter 4. It is packed with specific personal names: Onesimus, Aristarchus, Mark, Luke, Demas, Epaphras. He makes very specific requests. Tell Archippus to complete his ministry. Exchange this letter with the one from Laodicea.
That is a good point. If you're forging a letter, say 30 years after Paul's death, just to make a theological point, why would you stuff it full of all these mundane personal details that would be irrelevant by then?
It would be what one scholar called sophisticated camouflage. You'd have to be a master forger to invent all those trivial-sounding details to make it feel authentic. It's more plausible that they're just real.
What's the second argument for Paul?
Moo raises the ethical problem. The letter itself, in chapter 3, condemns lying and demands that believers speak the truth to one another. Would a disciple, writing in the name of an apostle who hated deception, begin his work with a lie? Would he write a fake letter and then sign it, as it says in chapter 4, "I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand"?
That does feel like a massive internal contradiction. Here is a letter all about truth that happens to be a forgery.
Exactly. Moo argues that this modern idea of innocent pseudepigraphy, this idea that everyone in the ancient world knew it wasn't really Paul but just accepted it as a literary device, is overstated. The early church was very concerned about forgeries. They actively threw out letters they believed were falsely attributed to apostles.
So if it is Paul, how do we explain the differences? How do we account for the unique vocabulary and the flowery style?
And that brings us to what might be the most elegant solution: the Timothy factor.
The Timothy factor.
Look at the very first verse of the letter, Colossians 1:1. Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus by the will of God, and Timothy, our brother.
Timothy is right there in the byline. He's listed as a co-sender.
Right. And both Bruce and Moo, among others, suggest that Timothy may have served as Paul's amanuensis, his secretary. But an amanuensis in the ancient world wasn't always just a stenographer taking dictation. They often had a significant degree of freedom to help draft and shape the letter.
So the scenario would be Paul in prison saying something like, Timothy, we've got this report from Epaphras. We need to write to the church in Colossae. Here are the main points I want to hit. Christ is supreme over all powers. Tell them to knock it off with the angel stuff and the weird rules and say hi to Nympha for me. Why don't you draft something up?
And Timothy drafts it. And maybe Timothy has a more literary, more liturgical style than Paul. Maybe Timothy's been reading different Greek authors and has a slightly different vocabulary. Paul then reviews it, approves it, maybe adds a few personal touches in his signature, and sends it off.
That seems like a very reasonable middle ground. It explains the stylistic shifts and the vocabulary differences while still maintaining the letter's claim to be from Paul, with his full apostolic authority.
It respects both the textual data and the letter's self-witness. So for our purposes in this deep dive, we're going to proceed with that framework. This is an authoritative letter emanating from the Pauline circle, Paul and Timothy, addressing a real situation in the early 60s.
And briefly on that point, where is he writing from? He's in prison, we know that much.
Yes, the prisoner of Christ Jesus. The traditional view, and the one most scholars still hold, is that he's imprisoned in Rome sometime in the early 60s AD. That fits with the people who are listed as being with him, like Luke and Aristarchus. It also fits the timeline and connection to the letter to Philemon, which is clearly a companion piece.
But there is an Ephesus theory, right?
There is. The main argument for an Ephesian imprisonment is proximity. Ephesus is only about 120 miles from Colossae. The argument goes that if the slave Onesimus ran away from Colossae, as we learn in Philemon, it makes much more sense for him to run 120 miles to Ephesus than over 1,000 miles to Rome.
But the consensus still leans toward Rome.
Both Moo and Bruce come down on the side of Rome. The dating seems to work best there, around AD 60-62. Which again puts it just before that devastating earthquake strikes the city.
Okay, so to recap the scene, we have a doomed city, a spiritually anxious church wrestling with this weltangst, and a letter arriving from Paul and Timothy in a Roman prison designed to tell them one thing: you don't need the extra magic. You already have the king.
That is the stage perfectly set.
I want to take a moment here to explicitly compare the voices of our guides. We've mentioned Bruce, Dunn, and Moo, but let's really distinguish their approaches for the listener so we know whose perspective we're hearing as we move forward.
That's a great idea. Let's start with F.F. Bruce. Think of him as the senior statesman of the group. He represents a classic, mediating evangelical voice. He takes that Merkabah mysticism view seriously. He thinks the Jewish visionary context is real and important, but he's also very committed to the authority of the text. He allows for Timothy's heavy hand in the writing to explain this style while still holding to Pauline authorship. He's comfortable with a bit of ambiguity.
Okay, Bruce is the mystic mediator. What about James Dunn?
Dunn is the historian of the parting of the ways. He is laser-focused on the social and theological tension between the emerging church and the established synagogue. He's the most skeptical of our three guides about Paul writing it directly, viewing it as post-Pauline. And he completely rejects the Gnosticism and folk magic ideas, insisting we read the philosophy as a sophisticated Jewish apologetic. For Dunn, it's all about the sociology of the synagogue versus the church.
So Dunn is the Jewish historian. That leaves Douglas Moo.
Moo is the evangelical exegete. He is the strongest defender of strict Pauline authorship. He champions that syncretistic folk belief view following Clinton Arnold. For him, the core issue isn't just Jewish law, it's pagan anxiety about evil spirits. So he focuses very heavily on themes of spiritual warfare and the absolute sufficiency of Christ to defeat those powers. His application is always very pastoral and direct.
Perfect. Bruce, the mystic mediator, Dunn, the Jewish historian, and Moo, the spiritual warrior exegete. That gives us a great framework.
It does. Three very different but very valuable lenses.
So bringing all those perspectives together, what's the one big idea of Colossians? If you had to boil the entire letter down to a single controlling theme, what would it be?
I think we both have to agree on this one. It's the absolute sufficiency and supremacy of Christ.
Sufficiency and supremacy. Unpack those two words for us in this context.
Supremacy means he is above everything else. There is no power, no angel, no demon, no ruler, no government, no elemental spirit of the universe that outranks him or is outside of his control. He is, to put it bluntly, the CEO of the cosmos.
And sufficiency.
Sufficiency means that because of his supremacy, he is enough for you. You don't need a supplement.
Yeah.
You don't need a spiritual booster pack. You don't need to hedge your bets with other religious systems. Christ is not a component in a spiritual system. He is the system.
That sounds wonderful theologically, but let's bring it down to the pavement. Let's build the application bridge. We talked about the Colossians Veltangs, their world anxiety.
Yes.
We might not use terms like elemental spirits or worry about the evil eye today. Well, most of us don't. But we are absolutely swimming in anxiety.
We have our own massive well-tanked. We live in a world that feels completely out of control. We're anxious about economic collapse, about political instability, about climate change, about pandemics. We fear being irrelevant, being canceled, being left behind.
And in the midst of that anxiety, the Jesus plus temptation is just as real for us as it was for them.
It's everywhere. We're constantly tempted to treat Jesus as necessary, but not sufficient.
Give me some concrete examples. What does that Jesus plus heresy look like for a Christian in the 21st century?
Okay, here's one. Jesus plus politics. I say I trust Jesus for my ultimate salvation, but my functional trust, my hope for security and safety in this world, is actually placed in my political party or my candidate winning the next election. I act as if the kingdom of God will literally fall if the wrong person is in power.
That's a big one. What's another?
Jesus plus New Age mysticism. The church is a bit boring, the Bible feels a little dry, so I need something more. I need a spiritual high, I need a vision, a direct experience, a feeling of energy. So we chase the experience rather than the person. We become spiritual adrenaline junkies instead of faithful disciples.
Or Jesus plus legalism, which is the flip side.
Exactly. I feel out of control, so I'm going to create a system of very strict rules about diet or media or how I dress that makes me feel like I am in control of my own righteousness and safety.
All of these are just modern versions of the same Colossian error.
They are all rooted in the same lie. The belief that Christ has secured our eternal destination, but he's left us vulnerable and defenseless in our present reality. It's the belief that the powers of this world, whether we call them spirits or economic forces or political movements, are still really running the show.
And Paul's answer is a resounding no.
A definitive no. He says, in him all things hold together. If Christ is the one holding the very atoms of your body and the galaxies of the universe in their place, he is more than sufficient to hold your life together. You do not need to hedge your bets.
That is a profound challenge. It's easy to sing Jesus is Lord on a Sunday morning. It is a whole other thing to live like Jesus is sufficient on a Tuesday afternoon when the stock market is tanking or the doctor calls with bad news.
And that's why this letter is so vital. It confronts us at the level of our deepest fears and asks us a fundamental question. Do we really believe he is who the Bible says he is?
So here is the question I want you, the listener, to take with you from this deep dive. We've talked about the Colossians being tempted to add angels and rules to feel safe. Here's the question for you. In what area of your life are you currently acting as if Jesus is necessary but not sufficient?
Where are you tempted to add a plus, a supplement to the gospel, to feel truly secure?
Is it your career, your financial plan, your political activism, your health and wellness routine? Where are you functionally trusting something or someone else to do for you what only Christ can do?
That's a question worth sitting with.
I want you to mull that over. And in our next deep dive, we're going to get into the heart of Paul's answer. We're going to chapter 1 to tackle one of the most famous, most beautiful, and most theologically controversial hymns in the entire New Testament, the poem about Christ as the firstborn of all creation.
Oh, that's a big one. That phrase, firstborn of all creation, that was the primary battleground of the Arian controversy in the 4th century. It's huge.
It's absolutely huge. Does it mean Christ was the first created being? Or does it mean he is the sovereign creator? We're going to dive right into the deep end on that one. We'll see you there.